Welcome to Have You Heard? An IDF podcast. This podcast is a service of the Immune Deficiency Foundation, a nonprofit organization that improves the diagnosis, treatment, and quality of life of people affected by primary immunodeficiency. People living with PI are the zebras of the medical world, and the IDF community is one big zebra herd. In today's episode, we will be taking a closer look at opportunities for young people of color in the fields of science. We will be talking with two experts, one in medicine and one in immunology, to help us gain a better understanding of how to address these concerns and why it matters. All right, let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode, Opportunities for Young People of Color in Science. I'm Catherine Lontock, and my role at IDF is as the Director of Science and Policy Communications. My academic background is in microbiology. I'm excited to be your host for today's podcast episode. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, employment in science, technology, engineering, and math fields, otherwise known as STEM, is projected to grow twice as fast in the next decade as for all other occupations. Even so, a recent Pew Center study reported that only 7% of recent graduates in STEM fields were Black students. That's only half the proportion of the general population that identifies as Black. And the numbers for Hispanic or Latino students are even lower. Here with us to discuss these issues as they relate to PI is Dr. Nicole Rochester, the Consulting Advisor on Health Equity at the Immune Deficiency Foundation, and Alexis Mobley, President and one of the founding members of Black and Immuno, as well as a PhD candidate in neuroimmunology at the University of Texas. Welcome, Nicole and Alexis, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Catherine. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks.
So to get us started, I'd like to learn a little bit more about your own backgrounds. Nicole, you are a pediatrician who now works as a consultant to medical systems and individuals. Can you tell us a little bit about your career transition?
Sure. I am a pediatrician, as you mentioned. That's all I've ever wanted to be since I was like 7 or 8 years old. And that's all I thought that I would ever be. I started in primary care after I finished my training. And then I transitioned to pediatric hospital medicine, had the pleasure of being a medical director and assistant professor, and got to teach medical students and pediatric residents in training. And my career transition was really inspired by my own caregiving journey with my late father, who had a lot of chronic health conditions, including diabetes and heart disease. And he was an end-stage renal disease patient on dialysis. And for the last 3 years of his life, my two older sisters and I were his caregivers. And it really gave me an insight and like dirty look into the healthcare system. And it was very, honestly, traumatic. It was very challenging. One of my older sisters is a nurse executive. And so between the two of us, we had probably over 30 years of medical experience, healthcare experience under our belts. And yet we still struggled to kind of manage my dad's medical care, not the care itself, but really the system in which he received care. And what I found over and over again is that my knowledge as a medical doctor, but also my influence and my privilege allowed me to be such a better advocate for my dad. And as we would navigate those situations, it just made me think about all of the other family caregivers and all the other patients who don't have the benefit of having a daughter who happens to be a doctor. And so after he passed away, I just couldn't stop thinking about the challenges that we faced and the knowledge that most people are facing this without that inside information. And so my company, Your GPS Doc, is centered around helping patients and family caregivers understand and navigate the healthcare system. And then in the context of that, my work has recently pivoted to health equity consulting, where I've had the honor of working with a lot of healthcare organizations who are committed to improving care for patients of color.
Okay. And Alexis, can you tell us a little bit about Black and Immuno and how you became involved with that?
Yeah, so Black and Immuno is a nonprofit organization that aims at amplifying, celebrating, and supporting Black voices in immunology. So we have a very robust program of our second year that we're working on. One of them is called the Black and Immuno Hub. But every year we have our Black and Immuno Week. Our first year, it was just about general immunology. This last session was about from bench to bedside to community. And so we talked about not only basic science, but translational science. And then we had patient advocates come in, and we had people talk to us about public mistrust in science and science communication. So it's a very robust program that we have that we work really hard on. So I'm super glad and super proud of that. I ended up getting involved just because I feel like, a lot of people around the time that George Floyd was murdered, there was definitely a call to action for a lot of people. And so that was the call to action for me. I had said enough is enough, and there has to be something that I can do, in my circles to get involved. And so one of them was definitely trying to bring more Black faces and more Black voices into STEM and into STEAM. And so I started, I had gotten to attend Black and Neuro, and I was like, man, I really hope whoever does the immunology one also loops me in. So so seriously, via a subtweet, I ended up meeting up with Joelle, and I was one of the co-founders of Black and Immuno, and it's just been fantastic working with everybody. We have volunteers all over the globe. We had attendance this last Black and Immuno week from every habitable continent, so I was also super happy about that. And so yeah, I just love the organization. We work not only with academic institutions, but journals and industry and pretty much anything in the scientific ecosystem, some government offices as well. So I'm just very happy for the work that we've done so far, some of the networking that we've gotten to do, and the people we've gotten to meet along the way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mentioned in my opening that the graduation rates for underrepresented students, particularly Black and Hispanic or Latino students in science fields, is not representative of their share of the population as a whole. What do you guys think are some of the contributing factors to that?
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, the only knowledge I can really lean on is my own, right? Wholly and honestly. And I think about even my own journey, all the way back from, elementary school now to almost finishing my PhD. And a lot of the bumps I had along the way, I did have several teachers along the way tell me, I'm not smart, I'm not good enough, you can't do this, you're not going to do anything amazing. And if I would have sat there and didn't have the support system that I had, that would have been the only thing ringing in my head. And so from the jump, I would not have been anything more than that because of some of the words that other people had put on me. I mean, even in higher ed. And so I think part of that is just depending on where you are, depending on what you're doing. I mean, it doesn't matter how great of a place you live, people still want to put that label on you. And so I think it really has to deal with the support systems and the voices that you're listening to every day and that have a really big influence over your life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Alexis said. As a physician, I can honestly say that I myself personally didn't face a lot of those types of barriers, but many, if not most of my physician colleagues have so many stories of starting in, middle school, high school, teachers and guidance counselors telling them, they say they want to be a doctor and they're being steered to other healthcare fields. Or maybe you should just be a nurse. And nurses are amazing. We love nurses. We need nurses. But there is this phenomena where students of color are told that they may not be up to the challenge of, becoming a scientist, a researcher, a physician. And they're sometimes steered into other healthcare professions or even steered away from healthcare in general. I think, a lot of times it also matters. Representation is so important. And so a lot of students of color don't see scientists and researchers and physicians who look like them. Again, I'm very blessed in that manner. I live in a part of Maryland that has lots of Black professionals. And so I've often had Black doctors and, Black accountants and Black lawyers and all those things, but a lot of people don't have that benefit. And so if you're not seeing that in your community, then you may not realize that that's possible for you as well. So I do think that it starts really early, and sponsorship and mentorship opportunities and internships and summer programs, many of which have lost funding. Prior to George Floyd's murder, we've had this myth in our country that these types of programs are no longer needed. And in fact, there have even been some that have actively tried to dismantle some of these programs that are meant at improving diversity in science, engineering, medicine, technology. So I'm excited to see a resurgence of interest in those types of programs and in funding, because I think that's incredibly useful for all the reasons that you mentioned, Catherine. We still have a long way to go.
Right. And so what are some of the benefits of having a more diverse field of researchers, clinicians, innovators?
There are a lot of benefits, specifically in medicine. I can tell you that there are published studies that actually demonstrate that patients of color, particularly Black patients, have better health outcomes when they're cared for by Black doctors. And it pains me to say that, but a lot of it initially was attributed to communication between, when people look like you, when they share your cultural background, when they share your experiences, then there is a level of rapport that goes with that. And so a lot of that has to do with just relationships and how we build rapport with patients. But more recently, there was actually a study that was published last year that even demonstrated some disparities in the birthing mortality for newborns, for Black newborns, and showed that in this large study that Black newborns who were cared for by Black doctors had a better outcome. And we can't attribute that to communication or rapport because, they're newborns. They don't talk, they don't communicate yet. So that's data that definitely needs to be, there needs to be additional studies to follow up on that, because as a pediatrician, that was incredibly disturbing to me. So that's just one reason. I mean, we know that Black patients and Latino patients have better outcomes. And we also know that physicians of color in particular are more likely to practice in underserved areas. So that's another reason why having diversity in medicine is just so incredibly important.
And Alexis, how do you see that playing out in immunology?
Yeah, I think it's always important because what's both good and bad, it's a double-edged sword that we have a lot of history in certain concepts in immunology, but it's also bad that we've had such long history and long concepts because people want to say, well, no, that's the way that it is no matter what. And they really want to stick to this idea and not have other, they have the blinders on. And so having more diverse understanding and people in your research is going to really inform the research and make it more robust, because then people can come in with a different eye and a different life experience, whether it be, how the disease impacted their communities. It doesn't always make sense. Like it's great that the US is looking at other diseases and we have research for things that are not endemic to the United States. But then at the same time, it's also very ill-informed research. You're just doing it kind of for the notoriety. You don't know how that impacts the community. You don't know how that affects, the healthcare researchers. And so to me, it just feels not genuine when people are like, oh, I'm going to study this thing. It seems just more of like a savior complex. But if you're able to get people to come in and say, hey, did you know that this medication really does XYZ? We need to probably think of a different formulation that doesn't do, ABC. And if you're not in the community, or if you don't realize that there's these other things that are impacting these individuals, it just doesn't seem like you're looking at the whole picture. And so that's why I think it's always important. Even when you work on something for a long time, I'm in that process right now of writing a manuscript. It gets to the point where I'm like, I need somebody else to look at this because, like I've like memorized this front and back. I know exactly what I'm going to say. Here's my transition. And so it's just nice having, other ideas and other people to look at and be like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. And so I think that's also why it's important just to have, something fresh and to keep a breath of fresh air in the research and where you're going and how you do your experiments.
I just want to add one more thing about the importance of diversity, and it relates to the current COVID-19 pandemic. And what we've seen, in communities of color is, decreased uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine, really due to well-earned mistrust in our communities because of what's been done, to us, to our communities. And that's just another reason to have a more diverse population of scientists and researchers and healthcare professionals, because we have seen how incredibly important that messaging is when it comes from someone who looks like us. It's much more likely to be adopted. And so, we're seeing now what happens when you haven't built that trust, when you haven't had representation, and then you find yourself, in this crisis that we're in. And there were just such huge gaps in reaching those marginalized communities and minoritized communities.
Right. So when each of you were in school, how diverse were your own classes? And I mean, not just your classmates, but your instructors as well. And did that actually change as you sort of moved up the academic career ladder, or stay the same? Any observations?
That's always funny. Let me start with saying both my parents were in the military. So I didn't do a lot of moving, but this also kind of informs my story. I lived in New York for a while, then I lived in New Mexico for a good little bit, and then I moved to Texas, where I spent most of my time growing up. And for me, talking about my classes, for the most part, I remember in elementary school, or I guess the early elementary school, kindergarten, first, second in there, I had a relatively good representation, I would say. I mean, I remember my best friend at the time, she was Black and Puerto Rican, and then we had a little Black boy that we'd hang out with. So there's at least, as I'm going to come to call it, but there were at least 3 pepper flakes there. And I remember my second grade teacher, or maybe it was my first or second grade, still in that time, she was a Black woman, older Black woman. But I didn't see another Black teacher until 7th grade, my English teacher, actually. And he was awesome. And then since then, I haven't seen another Black teacher, academic. So it's been crazy. Most of my professors have been predominantly white. Probably, I never asked. He was very racially ambiguous, but he at least had melanin. I know that much. But I don't know quite, where he hailed from. But he was a pretty prominent biology professor. But I mean, even in higher ed, I mean, even my PIs, they're both white, a male and a female. And I have one East Asian on my committee, so like, it's, for me, my journey has not at all been diversified. I've been the only one in the room most times that looks like me and has similar life experiences. I mean, even growing up and in high school, I could kind of hang out with the Black people, but a lot of them were like, don't hang out with us. They're like, no, like, you're going to go do great things. Like, this is not where you should be right now, in this season. And so that was always kind of discouraging, because I'm like, well, so it was always kind of that balance of, I was like too Black, or I was too white for the Black kids and like too Black for the white kids. And so that also kind of informed how how my life went and the things that I never quite noticed. I guess at the time it was like, oh, okay, this is the norm. That's all I knew. There wasn't any other way that life could be. And so just kind of like growing up now, I hear about like HBCUs and like a bunch of other things that you could do. I'm like, wait, there's more Black people out here doing stuff. Wait, hold on. And so that's one of the reasons I love a lot of the Black in groups, because then I could see other people that may have had a similar experience or maybe not. But then I'm like, okay, all of them I feel like are just like kind of like family reunions, people that I didn't know I was related to, but now we get to kind of come together and geek out and share stories and talk about research and things like that. So it can be interesting, but if you didn't know that there was any different, I mean, well, why fight for something if you don't know that it's possible, or being aware about it? So it's definitely an interesting way to kind of grow up, yeah.
So Nicole, you've actually alluded to that you probably had more representation than is sort of the average.
Yeah, I guess I would say so. I mean, interestingly, so I'm going to date myself here, but I am a 1970s baby. And so when I started kindergarten in the mid 70s, I actually was bused to an elementary school in a predominantly white neighborhood. So saying that, I feel so old. But yeah, I mean, I lived in a predominantly Black neighborhood in the early part of my elementary school years, and we were bused to this other school. I will say, while my older sisters had a pretty negative experience with busing, I guess by the time I came around, things were a little bit better. So I actually had a very positive experience in elementary school. Didn't have a lot of Black teachers, but there were 2 Black female teachers that I had, one in 3rd grade and one in 4th grade, that were like completely integral. And, I mentioned earlier about not being discouraged. And when I really reflect on it, that's probably part of it. I mean, they were so incredibly supportive, recognized that I was quote unquote gifted, and, fully supported my declarations when I would tell my classmates that I was going to be a doctor and I was going to be a pediatrician. So that was awesome. In high school, I was part of a special kind of a magnet program for science and technology. The program itself was predominantly white, but the school had a very large diversity. We had a lot of Black and white students. We also had a large Filipino population and Asian population. So that was a great experience. And so while there weren't that many Black students in my particular program, through my general classes and just, in the cafeteria and things like that, I had an opportunity to be around people who looked like me. I went to college at Johns Hopkins University, and our class at the time was the largest. They had the largest number of Black students that they had ever had. And that seemed to follow me. So then when I went to medical school, it was the same thing. At that time, we had the largest group of Black medical students. I think we were about 10 to 15% of our medical school class. So that, it's not huge, but that's close to the representation of, African Americans in the United States. And we also happened to have a Black dean, like the dean of our medical school at the time was a Black man. So it was really an incredible time to train. My professors, on the other hand, were not Black. I may have had one professor in medical school, and definitely we had a lot of teachers who perpetuated these myths. We were constantly taught about all the disparities, and Black patients have more this and more that. But it was put in a context that would have made us believe that there were some type of biological differences, which we know are not true. And back then, I think there wasn't as great of an understanding of social determinants of health. So as medical students, this information was really portrayed to us as, Black people are either like biologically inferior, or if they would just do better, eat better, exercise. But myself and my other Black medical students, we were kind of like, I guess, rebels, you could say. So we actually, went to the dean and made complaints about some of the lectures that we had at the time, and were able to have some changes done. So I guess I think I definitely have benefited from having fellow students that look like me, even if it's a small number, and even having some mentors and teachers who look like me as well. And that's why I'm just such a huge proponent of this for the generation that's behind me.
Right, right. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break and we will talk some more in just a few moments.
IDF is seeking new ideas to address 3 topics that are relevant to the PI community. In an effort to seek new solutions, IDF is sponsoring a white paper challenge and invites submissions to address innovative practices to expand awareness in communities of color, methods to increase equity in clinical trials, novel approaches to shortening the time between diagnosis and treatment. This challenge is open to all individuals, institutions, schools, and researchers for an opportunity to be awarded $10,000 for your project. To apply, please visit www.primaryimmune.org/challenge.
Welcome back. We are speaking with Alexis Mobley and Dr. Nicole Rochester to discuss the lack of diversity in science and medicine and what we can do to support young people of color interested in these fields. So after breaking down some of the issues that we talked about earlier and explaining why diversity is so important, let's talk about what we can do to support young people. Many don't know about some of the scientific advances made by Black scientists and physicians. Can you share some of those with our listeners?
Sure. So there are, many firsts in terms of Black physicians. And unfortunately, we're still seeing firsts. I mean, I don't know if that's fortunately or unfortunately, but we're still seeing firsts in medicine. But I guess if I were to go all the way back to the beginning, I always like to honor Dr. James McCune Smith, who was the first Black American to receive a medical degree. And this was back in 1837. Unfortunately, he received his degree not in the United States because he wasn't allowed to do that at that time. But he did go on to later practice in the United States. And then, a few years later in 1864, we have Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, who was the first Black woman in the United States to receive a medical degree. And I mean, there's a long list of pioneers in medicine. Dr. Charles Drew, who's known as the father of blood banking and, did a lot of work to related to like blood preservation techniques, all the things that are used in major surgery today. Dr. Andrea Hayes Jordan is someone who I always like to honor. She's a pediatric surgeon, and she pioneered techniques for groundbreaking therapies for pediatric cancer, for conditions that were previously considered to be incurable. And then most recently, I've been a huge fan of Dr. Uche Blackstock. She's an emergency medicine physician, but she's like a huge DEI champion, anti-racist champion. She's the founder and CEO of an organization called Advancing Health Equity. If you're not following her on Twitter, you absolutely should be. She also has an amazing twin sister, Dr. Oni Blackstock. So I could go on and on and on, but there are definitely lots of contributions to medicine on behalf of Black physicians.
Yeah, so for me, man, I feel like any Black researcher is a great champion just because I feel like nobody knows we exist. Even if you think about flyers or, thinking about what a scientist would be, I almost incline that you would probably think of, an older white male, because it's just kind of what we've seen, and people that have communicated with us. I'm so grateful for people like Raven, the science maven. She does a lot of really cool science, and she's a great science communicator, and she's just always out there having fun, and she's absolutely amazing. She's so sweet. I've been able to work with her on a couple projects with the Black and X movements. But I mean, I feel like if you see a Black scientist, love on them, follow them. I don't know, it's just, there's a lot of honestly great research that's happening out of Africa as well. I'm gonna do a shameless plug for Black and Immuno. We record all of our sessions from throughout the week. And so I think one great video would be our Unsung Heroes panel, where we took the time to have people nominate. We had a historian actually come in and talk about historically different Black researchers and physicians that actually really changed science in different ways, in ways that you may not have originally conceptualized, like vaccination. That was only brought over because of the slave of, and see, I can't remember the dude's name, but his slave was the one that introduced him to vaccination, and really vaccination on this side of the planet. So it's like, without Black people, where would you be? And so the Unsung Heroes panel, I think, was amazing. Just having that history and having other people also nominate some of their mentors and friends for the work that they were doing. And then the other thing that I'm going to say here is we had a lot of scientific talks from people that were in Africa, talking about COVID and talking about malaria and talking about, we've had people that grew up there talking about hookworms and things like that. And again, just the work that they're doing, you may not realize, like, okay, Africa, they really want to continue to, disenfranchise and just strip any advancements that are happening there from the continent. But there's some really awesome things that are going on, and things that are, that they're doing for infectious disease, which isn't as important here because, we don't get that stuff, but it's really changing the world and epidemiology as we know it, which is always amazing.
So what steps should we be taking to engage and support young people more, and at what level?
I think it starts really early. I mean, we know that, this nurturing an interest in science and technology and medicine really starts early. And I can attest to that myself, being a 7, 8-year-old. And for me, it was really just something that was not only fostered by my parents, but also, as I mentioned earlier, my teachers. So I think that we need to ensure that students of color have the access to appropriate science education. And when I say appropriate, ideally by not necessarily teachers who look like them, although that is ideal, but at least that it's presented in a way where their contributions, the contributions of their people, are amplified and elevated. So much in education, the perspective is that, students of color really don't often see ourselves in those contributions. Everything is kind of once a month in February, we learn all the things that Black people did, and then we go back to a very white-centered educational model. And so I think having those contributions being incorporated throughout science education, increased funding in under-resourced schools, which we know because of systemic racism in our country tend to be in Black and brown neighborhoods. So increased funding for schools in those communities. Many of them don't even have science labs. I mean, science is fun, but if you don't have beakers, if you don't have the equipment in your school where you can actually conduct experiments and see firsthand what science is, and it doesn't really come alive for you. And so I think a lot of times there's this misconception that science is boring or that science is hard. I also think, as we talked about earlier, there really needs to be a way to evaluate teachers and the disparities in education. Just like now we're finally starting to acknowledge disparities in health outcomes. Teachers need to be held accountable for how they interact with students of color. There need to be reporting mechanisms so that students and parents can report these instances that Alexis and I have talked about, where students are literally being told, you're not smart enough, you're not good enough, why don't you consider this? Guidance counselors are also, unfortunately, a big part of the problem. So I just think that starting at really in elementary school, we really need to examine how science is taught to students, how their interests are fostered, how they're being discouraged. And as you go all the way through the academic ladder, we just need to continue to improve representation, so that, there are teachers who look like the students and who represent the communities as well. So those are just a few ideas.
Okay. Alexis, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think, like Dr. Rochester said, early and often, you can't, I've loved science from the jump and in all of its different forms. And so that was something that I had known from really little that I wanted to get involved in science. It's just the more science I learned, the more my field changed, and blossomed into something different. And so I think it's important that, again, if you start talking about different types of science and making it, age appropriate, you'll start getting people interested in maybe some of these obscure fields, immunology, biochemistry, genetics, I guess, like, the biomedical sciences, biomedical engineering. And then giving them, again, noticing the history and their contributions, also being able to see yourself where you are. I think you can also get kind of discouraged when you hear different stories. One of them, the most common, is Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin. And
Right.
that's not common, in science. And so it's also like you always hear these stories of, things being taken and stolen, and we've already had so much taken and stolen. Do you really want to keep doing that, the rest of your life? So science also evolving to acknowledge and give praise where praise is due, and not just to the status quo, and just by default trusting and believing that.
Mm-hmm. So what is your piece of advice for implementing change at a systemic level?
Go vote.
Okay.
At the very basics of it, I think the thing that really stuck with me as I've been learning in my advocacy journey is that you can't really call yourself an activist until you've actively changed, like, laws, because that's where the systemic issues are. And so, again, like Dr. Rochester was saying about having more money to these schools, that's based off of your property taxes, and you're allowed to go to your school board, and you're allowed to go to your city and petition so that your taxes are distributed in a different fashion. And that would radically change what we see from the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
from kindergarten and on, because now people that need the most funding and the most money to really get their education on the same level as the entire district would go so much further. And so I would just say, just be aware of different policies and how you can intervene. You don't have to do all of them, but, find the one that's important to you, and somebody else will take, the other things, and then really just go and try to change something, and work towards that.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with everything Alexis said. And I just want to amplify what she, said regarding equity, and that certain communities are going to need more resources. I think here in America, we kind of pride ourselves on this falseness of equality, where like we all have the same thing, which is not true. Or, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, you can do it too, which is not true. So I think, the systemic change that needs to happen is really having that equity lens for every single policy, every single structure, in our community and in our country, and making sure that those who have historically been marginalized and discriminated against, they actually need increased resources and increased support, and that's okay. And so we need to really approach the problem with that lens. And I also think, from a systemic standpoint, measurement and accountability are key. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in medicine, we are finally starting to disaggregate data. We're really starting to look at health outcomes specifically for Black people, for Latino people, for Native American people. And we're discovering these huge disparities. And so I think we need to do that with everything, that every outcome really needs to be measured based on race and ethnicity and language and gender identity and, all of the things that tend to separate us. And then people need to be held accountable. It's one thing to publish papers and talk about observations, but it's another thing to begin holding institutions accountable for those disparities. So that's what I'm looking for in the coming years.
Okay. Are there any other topics that we didn't touch on you'd like to discuss?
Diversify your friend list, diversify what you're getting involved in. if you, as you're working towards being, anti-racist, one of the most important things I feel like is just diversify. If all your friends look exactly like you, if all your news sources look exactly like you, that may not be the best way to go about life. So, I mean, there's a lot of people all over now with social media that's really important. Follow one extra person that doesn't look like you. Get your content from a bunch of different sources and slowly work towards understanding other voices. You can only do so much with maybe your one trophy friend, but try to do some things and work towards um, a whole different system. And I think that's just important to also realize and stress. So yeah, follow all of the Black and movements on Twitter and find the individual scientists and go onto the different databases that they have and just find something new, and look at something different, essentially.
That's great advice. Do you have any recommendations for resources to learn more about engaging young people of color in science?
Other than, I would say for medicine, the National Medical Association is our, medical association specifically for Black physicians. And there's always a host of programs. There's a Student National Medical Association for medical students, and they often have programs aimed at outreach, even for elementary, middle school, high school, at the college level. So I think that's one organization that people can follow. And just, again, amplifying what Alexis just said about diversifying your network. And, social media is an amazing tool. And because of the way these algorithms work, which some are a little bit scary to me sometimes, but once you start following a couple of people from a particular community, then it shows you, hey, if you're following this person, you may want to follow that person. And for me, over the last couple of years, that's really been a way that I've been able to diversify my network and, looking at those suggestions to follow. So I think that's awesome. And, just getting involved in your community, finding out what are the community-based organizations that are affecting or looking at STEM, and getting involved in your school system. If you are a Black scientist, Black medical professional, volunteering, showing up for like career day and things like that, those things really make a difference, especially in communities where they don't see a lot of scientists and doctors and things like that look like them.
I know that NSF and the NIH both have programs for people that are done or in high school and undergrad that need some research experience. Again, shameless plug. We have that video also on our YouTube channel. We're working to get the emails, the PowerPoint slides for everybody as well, so that we can disseminate more information about some of these paid research experiences that you can do. Yeah, and then like Dr. Rochester said, just volunteer. Just the fact that that I would show up to places and do things, yes, I look incredibly young. So even some of my child's friends thinks that I'm her sister. And so I'm like, oh no, I'm her mom. And, just talking to the kids, and just being there and saying, oh no, I do science. That's been so pivotal, just seeing how excited kids are. I didn't have to say more than that. Just like, oh no, I'm just sitting there reading a paper, They're just like, oh my gosh, it's a scientist, look. And so it's just, one of those things is just, sometimes just existing is enough.
Yes.
And, you don't have to do more than that. And so just show up, show up in different ways, show up how you feel most comfortable. That's all we need, just show up and be there. So.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for being here today and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, it was so much fun. Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners for being with us today. The Have You Heard podcast is part of IDF's work to empower the PI community through advocacy, education, and research. Continue to share this information and join us for more podcast episodes in the future as we explore the topics that mean the most to you. Until then, all of us here at IDF want to wish you good health and strength. And remember, the IDF community is rare and powerful.
This podcast is a service of the Immune Deficiency Foundation. If you like our show and want to learn more, please subscribe to this podcast so future episodes will be sent to your device automatically. To learn more about primary immunodeficiency and the PI community, please visit the IDF website at www.primaryimmune.org. And if you have a question you would like answered, email us at idf@primaryimmune.org. Thanks for tuning in.